All right. I'm on page 25. We're in chapter 1, the soul. New subject, right at the heading, the imitation of the divine. Frankel writes in the last of his 10 theses concerning a person. He says, the person is to be understood finally as the likeness of God. The human can comprehend him or herself only from the perspective of transcendence. We spoke about this many times, about the importance of a human being identifying themselves as the soul, as opposed to the other parts of themselves, body and ego and so on. And he's saying, person really can only know themselves through the perspective of transcendence. Transcendence meaning that a person is kind of, in a certain sense, above the world, above worldliness. The human is human only insofar as he grasps himself in relation to God. Human being is only truly human, and as much as he relates himself to God and understands himself vis-a-vis that relationship. He is a person only in the measure that he personifies transcendence, tuned and resonant with the summons of transcendence. Transcendence, meaning to say, is the behaviors and thoughts and speech which rise above, human action based on desires and peers and everything of this world. It's based on, again, as he said, his relationship with God, based on God's will, based on the ultimate and absolute values, moral values, which are godly. And that is the true person. That person transcends. He transcends this world and belongs to, is connected with all the worldliness. That's a true human being. In other words, human being is someone who's doesn't roller coaster with the different passions and emotional, selfish emotions that they have, or even due to different events that occur to them. But they're above that. They are steered by the absolute values of the 7 Noahide laws. The summons of transcendence is heard in the conscience. The conscience is the registry of transcendence. The true discovery of the human, inventio hominis, occurs in the imitatio Dei. So the discovery of the human being occurs through the imitation of God. In other words, the imitation of God is the true human being. So this is very important to understand, because obviously, first of all, it's a much deeper and more powerful demand of ourselves. We're looking at ourselves very differently. It's not that we're a dude or a dudette in this world, and we try to be nice people. In other words, we're just regular Joes, but we try to be a little better. What he's saying is that's what the person is all about. That's their center. That's their real beating heart of the person. Their real identity, who they are, is to be a person who follows, these moral values, and through them, as I said, and keeps them despite the different winds that blow in the world. And so the difference is, obviously, is that It's not something we do if it's convenient. It's not something we do if we have a moment after we get finished taking care of all our needs and pleasures, but it comes first because it's who we really are. It's without that, I mean, put it to you this way. Nobody wants to be an animal. No one wants to be a beast. We all want to feel, I mean, it's the basic to be a human being. In other words, that's what we're saying here. We're saying this is really the basic of being a real person. And so it's absolutely vital. The true discovery of the human, the inventio homines, occurs in the Imitatio Dei, in imitating God, again, as we said in the past, walking, which means walking in his ways. So if he's kind, so should we be kind. If he clothes the naked, so should we. If he visits the sick, so should we, and so on. Those are the forms of imitating God. Next paragraph. An important meaning of the imitation of God in Noahide teaching is imitation or emulation of divine attributes or qualities. So what it means, at least one of the meanings in Noahide teaching is emulating the divine attributes. He's talking Kabbalistically, those are generally counted as 10. These attributes, also known in the language of the Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism as the spheros, they are the or you translate spheros. Well, he said attributes and different manifestations of God. What are they? They're qualities created by God in terms of which the creation is patterned and ordered. There are different qualities that God created because God's really above all definition, but he created these qualities in order to order the world with them. They are, in the words of Maimonides, characteristic of God's actions, not that they actually inhere in himself, for there is no description of God himself of which his creatures are capable of comprehending, and so on. Thus, Noahide theology presents the human soul as possessing a number of attributes: chesed, gvura, tiferes, and so forth. This is love, severity or discipline, harmony. They're all relating to the same, transcendent divine attributes. The difference is not only in degree. The difference between the divine attributes and the way a human being can imitate them are not just different in degree, but in other ways. In human beings and in the world affected by the deeds of humans, these qualities can only take on an unholy expression. Love can, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. These qualities can also take on an unholy expression. They are amoral. They can either be good or evil, these qualities. And obviously it's not something possible as them being divine. But in the human being, they can be that way. So love can be other-directed or it can be venal and self-indulgent. So too, the quality of severity can express itself in self-discipline and sanctification, or it can take on the face of violence and aggression. There is a struggle between the spiritual and the animal and the human being as to whether intellect will model human attributes on the divine, or whether the self-centered character of the animal dimension of the person will prevail and even capture intellect. So, in other words, there are 10 divine-like attributes that a human being has, and there's also 10 selfish animalistic attributes. And it's up to the person to fight with his mentally and with God's help, and to, again, as I said, using his brain to make sure that the divine attributes dominate, the holy attributes dominate. Okay. The purpose of the biblical commandments is, through their performance, to convert the attributes of human nature into their divine expression. That's a very, very key sentence there. What's the purpose of the commandments? To convert human attributes and human nature into their divine expression. So to turn our nature into a divine nature. The 613 divine commandments, Maimonides writes, were given to the Jewish people to, quote, rectify behaviors and to make deeds upright. And for similar reasons, we could say were the 7 Noahide laws with all their details given to humanity at large in order to rectify behaviors and make deeds upright. There's absolutely no doubt that that's the case, that that's the purpose for which they were given. At least one of them is to rectify the human being and help perfect the human being and help the human being make sure that their attributes are emulating the divine attributes, and that should be expression, their nature and their character should be an expression of the divine. Last night, I happened to have been at the resting place of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And there's got, they always have a TV going over there with the Rebbe's talks. And so before you leave, you sit down for a few minutes to listen. And I couldn't believe it. Well, I mean, I'm not surprised that he was talking about the B'nai Noach and all of humanity, but he was, among many other things. About every, 2 seconds, he's saying something. He's adding some new idea. But the point is that I found it quite interesting that the Rebbe said that the Chabad approach, based on the Midrash, for why the Torah was given and what is the mission really of the Jewish people. In Tanya, it says that the purpose of the world and the purpose of the Torah and the mitzvahs was to make the lower worlds, the most lowly world, this one, the physical world, material world, into a dwelling place for God. So that's something that we read in the books. But the Rebbe added something else. He said every human being is also part of the same mission, to make this world a dwelling place for God, done through the 7 laws, but nevertheless, it's the same mission. So I bring this up here because he's talking about what is the purpose of the Noahide code. What's the purpose of the 7 laws? And he's saying to rectify behaviors, to perfect the human being, to make sure the human being is an expression of the divine. But there's another aspect. So that's in terms of human perfection. But in terms of God's pleasure and worldly perfection, there's the other aspect of the mission being to make the world a dwelling place for God. So I think that's I found that quite profound, quite fascinating. Because, I mean, it implies a deeper level than simply civilizing the world. It implies a much more, mystical, bent on an explanation for the 7 laws than I think I've ever really heard before. So it was really quite interesting to hear. So we're all in this together. We're all working together to bring about, God's ultimate desire and objective in creating the world. Quite amazing. Okay. Page 27, second paragraph. Along these lines, it has been written that the individual Noahide laws are associated with specific divine attributes, such that the fulfillment of the Noahide actualizes the divine attributes, at least in a diminished reflection of their transcendent divine quality. In other words, they're a reflection of the original, of the divine attributes, but nevertheless, they do emulate. So such that the fulfillment of the Noahide actualizes the divine attributes in the human being. Accordingly, for example, observance of the prohibition of forbidden sexual relations rescues chesed, rescues loving kindness, and perfects it. It saves it from self-directed gratification to love within divinely sanctioned sexual bonds. It gives the attribute of chesed, loving kindness, in the human being a form which models the divine attribute of chesed, of loving kindness, or at least it negates the travesty and the defiling, right, of this attribute. So So again, it's a totally other view. It's not just, a person is careful not to violate the sexual prohibitions because they're going to get punished, and because it's just there's some negative reason, like it's animalistic or something. We have to stay away from all impure things, but there's a positive aspect to it. Person emulates the divine. The person's characteristic of loving kindness becomes sanctified through disciplining this quality. It's a totally other way of looking at our actions and behaviors. We're not running away from monsters and dragons, which is the way to look at it if you simply think of it as a prohibition of running away from impurity, but we are building a beautiful edifice. We are designing and beautifying our quality of love and kindness. Paragraph at the bottom of page 27. Thus, the Maharal of Prague writes that after a series of descents for human society through transgression of the 7 Noahide laws, 7 great tzaddikim, righteous figures of spiritually global importance in their successive generations, rectified the individual transgressions of the Noahide laws in society, initiated in preceding generations. So there were 7 righteous people who corrected the corruption of the breaking of the 7 Noahide laws. Abraham set forth an exemplary conduct which corrected sexual licentiousness. I can't say it, but anyway, you can read the word. Licentiousness. Anyway, Isaac rectified the perversion of justice. Jacob blasphemy. Levi theft. Kahat, which was son of Levi, idolatry. Amram murder, and Moses the full import of the transgression of improper treatment of nature, framed as consuming the living of a living animal, as we'll talk about later on. And as much as Abraham personified to the humanly possible degree the divine attribute of kindness, Isaac severity, Jacob harmony, and so on down to the order of divine attributes known as the emotional attributes, we can infer a correlation between the Noahide laws and the divine attributes. Because there were 7 of them, and there are 7 emotional attributes of the divine attributes. The extension of an individual human personality, modeled on the divine fulfillment of the Noahide laws, is a goodly, harmonious, and orderly society. In other words, if we extend it to the public at large, what rises out of it and what develops from it is an harmonious and orderly society. It's interesting that he says both harmonious and orderly, because you can have an orderly society that's not harmonious. It has a lot of tension and, God forbid, oppression, but it could be very controlled and orderly. But this is a harmonious in which people do get along, and there's brotherly love between people and cooperation, and it's also orderly. The practical goal of the Noahide laws is a civilized society, both in terms of the relationships of the human being with God and with other human beings. And of course, there's one other aspect is human beings with nature. This ideal has been called the settled habitation of the world. The universal norm of civilization. This is not simply an ideal, a plus. Its absence is seen as something profoundly negative. An uncivilized world is a barbaric world. So in other words, a world without the 7 laws is considered a barbaric place, even if we don't see it necessarily with our eyes on a daily basis. But so it's not something extra. It's the same idea we said before on the individual level, that a human being is only human vis-a-vis vis-a-vis his relationship with God, and to whatever extent the person imitates the divine attributes. Similarly, a whole society is also the same, to the extent that there's observance and respect for the values and the commandments and instruction of the 7 laws. You have a civilized society. Without it, it's uncivilized. Any questions or comments till here? What's going on? 7 participants, 0 chat. Let's see, any hands up?
Just a quick question, Rabbi.
Okay, I'm so glad, because I was getting worried that this is boring and that nobody is stimulated by this. Okay.
Would the world before the flood be considered the barbaric world he's talking about here?
Certainly, but I think in a more, to obviously a lesser degree, but yet also true. Any society that's not governed by the 7 laws is going to be a barbaric one, to one extent or another. Maybe not that bad, you know, but having, you know, some very severe problems with it, which is why I made mention of what I said before, of even though we may not see it. So I'm just saying, even in our society, and I'm really not one to be some kind of a doomsday sayer, or everything's horrible, life used to be great and now it's terrible. I'm not saying that. However, the other side is also true, that I think sometimes, you know, there may be more of certain problems than we realize, whether it's in terms of corruption, whether it's in terms of sexual disloyalty in society, you know, and other sexual related transgressions of the 7 laws. So those things and that's again why this is so important. It has to do with, you know, how a person looks at himself, if they can bend or compromise on this. So a person, same thing with the society as a whole. If the society, despite serious failings, look at itself as civilized and progressive, or, well, put that word aside, but enlightened, okay, put it that way, enlightened and civilized, despite such behaviors, then, well, it's a society that can't fix itself. It can't come to repentance, because the society thinks it's doing really well. Things are great, no problems. You have to recognize the problem. And the bigger the person, the more a sin is something that they feel, they feel the violation. In other words, because the more a person understands God's greatness, the more the person feels that even a more minute act is a violation and very serious. I mean, I think the Zohar gives an example of somebody standing before the king and I think, you know, touching their nose or something, that could be punishable by death in front of the king. No, not in front of the president of the United States, but kings, as you know, long ago, that would be considered disrespectful, considered a lack of fear, showing a lack of fear of the king when you're standing at attention. So the idea, obviously, it's not the point of whether we can touch our nose while we're praying or not, isn't so much the point, although probably better not to. But the point is that we have to be more careful about examining our actions without stressing out and freaking out, but nevertheless being more attuned and more aware of our shortcomings and trying to do something about it, being optimistic about how we can change, and in that way also making the world into a dwelling place for God. The more we're a dwelling place for God, the more the whole world is. Anyway, I took that question and ran with it a little bit. I don't know if, did I answer your question? Maybe a little harshly. What I'm kind of saying is that even in this society, if it's not following the 7 laws, it's also, from the definition, a Noahide definition, it's also uncivilized. It's not like the generation of the flood. I mean, that was a total denigration. But it's not like Sodom either. Sodom and Gomorrah and Amorah. It's not like those places either. But definitely we have a lot of problems that need fixing. There's no question about that. The more we can affect other people to try to bring them back to bring them to proper moral conduct and family-centered life and honesty and away from some of the crazy greed that people are into and consumerism, and to bring them back to, and to to turn people on, so to speak, to a relationship with God. I mean, the more we can do that, the better. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, what we're saying here today is that a human being is a being that imitates God, is a being that expresses divine-like attributes, and so falling below that, to a certain extent, is falling below the level of a true human being. And the point of this is not to depress everyone and make them feel bad if we slip, but at the same, but it is in order for us to be more meticulous. And it's kind of like, the royalty, the sons of royalty, sons and daughters, their behavior has to be in a certain way. And they were responsible. There was a time when they used to have a governess to teach the children certain things that they had to know, to teach them how people of nobility had to behave. The point I'm trying to bring out simply is that we're all nobility. Every single human being is noble. Every single being is created in God's image. And so we have to live up to that. That's how we have to look at it. When we don't live up to it, we have to think, I'm framed in the image of God. This is, how could I, behave like that? It's below me to behave in a dishonest manner, in an animalistic type manner. Okay. All right. Let's go on a little bit. Okay. Now we're up to part one on page 28, section 3, Revelation. The law is concrete and historically given. Also, two important aspects. It's concrete, not vague, and historical. The imitation of God is in terms of concrete conduct. Frankel employs an analogy of visual perspective. The perspective in a picture, the course of the so-called vanishing lines, which uniformly converge in a certain point, is thoroughly dominated by this point, known as the vanishing point. The point is virtual. It is not at all in the picture, in the very picture which it in fact dominates. It is not actually represented in the picture. It does not itself appear in the picture. It is not at all given to perception, and yet it is constitutive for the picture. Truth is, I'm not really aware of this type of a picture, but I think the point is just kind of like there's a horizon, there's some central point which all other images, the shapes are drawn to. And in this case, it's a point in the picture which is not even drawn into it. And yet it's a central point. So what does that mean? What does that have to do with us? It is no different with that which we term values. They seem also to converge to a uniform point. And when we sufficiently consistently pursue these value lines within existence, then in fact, that point, transcendent and yet constitutive, in which these values lines converge, has to become manifest. In other words, there's one point. What is that one point that he's talking about? I am the Lord your God, I think is where he's going. There's one concept that from that really flows everything else. It would be at this point, this one which unites all values. Perhaps the principal Jewish prayer, which consists of the 6 Hebrew words, Hear, O Israel, and states that the one God is only one, in its deepest and ultimate meaning can be interpreted in this sense. I think, in other words, that this unity of morality, this unity of idea, this unity of value that comes from one single point is the meaning of the Hear, O Israel prayer. That God is one in a certain sense, that there's one fundamental point of value that everything flows from that. Of course, the way I said it is a little bit differently, and that is that everything stems from belief in God. Everything stems, but the point is that all the different attributes are from God and based on His will, and ultimately have a certain harmony to them and uniformity to it. I don't mean uniformity in a boring way of like cookie cutter copying, but the point is that everything is works together and really is one whole. In his terms, these value lines or values of universal conscience return to the central vanishing point, namely the teaching of the one God. The imitation of God finds concrete expression in the specific conduct of the Noahide laws. So, in other words, what he's saying is to say just vaguely, we have to imitate God. That leaves a lot of discretion to people, and that can become confusing and also, we're often, a little blind or and prejudiced in our own favor. But when you have concrete rules and instructions, you can't falter and get confused, at least certainly not as easily. Indeed, one of Frankel's major students, Elizabeth Lucas, has written that turning to page 30 now, that the content of universal conscience and higher human purpose is bounded. The meaning which Frankel encouraged human beings to find in life was not relative or purely subjective. Usually, most psychologists, they tell people to find what's meaningful to them, what makes them happy, what makes them feel meaningfulness inside. This is different. It's not just subjective. Rather, in Lucas's words, the conscience is an appreciation of values, which is a precursor of all that is moral. That every human being instinctively carries with him or herself, that we all have a certain compass of knowing what's really moral. Now, it is not, in other words, if we're really honest with ourselves and we peel away any type of prejudices, biases, ego-driven rationalizations, and we just deal with the conscience itself, we all really come to the same point of knowing what's right and what's not. Next paragraph. Now it is not and has not been within the ability of virtually all of humanity to receive directly the prophecy which contains these laws. Adam, Noah, and the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it appears, could perceive the divine will and even learn the divine law before it had been given at Sinai. So there were people who reached such a high level of divine intellect and understanding of God that they were able to figure out what the divine laws on their own. Although we actually learned in other sources that they were prophets, and for example, Adam, Noah, Shem, that they received prophecies from God about the 7 laws. But here he's going with the approach is that they learned them themselves. Okay. It took Moses with his unique power of prophecy to receive the law and communicate it concretely to humanity. All the other biblical writings, including the prophets, relate to the 5 books of Moses, as does the tradition of commentary. In other words, everything else is facing the 5 books. The prophets are commenting on the 5 books. They are rebuking the people about not keeping what's written in the 5 books. It's all that's the central writing and the central source. And the same thing, the oral law comments and interprets and explains what's written in the 5 books of Moses. So that is to say, it is not merely an article of belief that the divine teaching was given in its generality and particularity, and has so been transmitted and elucidated down to the present. But this is also experientially confirmable by resonance of the received doctrine in the human soul. In other words, what he's arguing is, I think, is that if we're true and honest with ourselves, that the values that are in the 5 books resonate with the person, with his conscience, that part of it. The content of the imitation of God and the Noahide laws is not only concrete and specific, but also necessarily historical. So it also has a very long and rich history. Religion must have a historical lineage too, or a recognition of the revelation. It has to be connected with the revelation that was given to Moses, which produced, "Hear Israel, God our God, God is one." In addition to its prefiguration in Abrahamic monotheism. So besides its original prefiguration in its development into Abrahamic monotheism, it also has to be connected to the "Hear Israel, God our God, God is one" fundamental principle. I think where he's getting at is quite clear. I mean, just like Maimonides says that to be from the righteous of the nations, according to Maimonides, you don't have, not just that you should keep the 7 laws, but you also keep it because it was given by God to Moses. So there's a connection back to the 7 laws, also to the 5 books of Moses and to the prophecy of Moses, something very specific. Moses was given these laws specifically in a prophecy. It's not something that he realized was by looking at the world and God's kindness in the world. You know, Abraham may have found and realized what God's attributes were by examining creation. And so too the other great righteous people. But that's not the case with Moses. Moses received a prophecy. That's what he's saying, which specified exactly what was to be done and what was the punishment and what was, what kind of repentance and so on and so forth. And it's not just that there was an instruction, for example, with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they also kept these things, but they kept it by understanding, again, as I said, God's attributes and his standards. But the concrete, exact, literal kind of black letter law was given to Moses. Okay, otherwise, in Frankel's words, as follows, bottom little paragraph on page 30. A person without traditional religious affiliation will be none other than one who has no language. For religious language in general, and for the average person, is only that of tradition-bound religious affiliation, or it is nothing. So this is interesting here. He's simply saying that a person has to have a tradition-based affiliation. But is he saying that, for example, if you grew up Christian, you should stick with it? Is that what he's saying? I mean, I'm not sure what Frankel meant, but I think that the author of the book does not mean that. But he does mean that you should be following, according to a historical tradition of Abrahamic values and Mosaic law. Okay. I mean, I think there's emotional reasons for that. There's issues of stability, as we all know. I mean, it's a question that comes up so often in the Noahide community of the desire to be close, to belong to a community. And that's why it's actually so great that we have the team. Yeah. Okay, page 31, the paragraph starting the reconnection. The reconnection with transmitted universal law jars with modern secular conceptions of human autonomy and freedom. So it seems to conflict the reconnection with these universal laws conflicts with modern conceptions of autonomy and freedom. Such a concept of freedom is freedom from, but freedom could cogently mean freedom from a norm which constrains human desires, only if the person did not have a soul created in the image of God, which mandated that norm. So, in other words, there's different forms of freedom, but the freedom that usually in modern language, the meaning of that freedom is to be freedom from some type of obligation. And I think what he's saying is that that idea is only because the understanding of so many of traditional values are not seen as I said before, in the positive light of them being a reflection and expression of the human being's image of God. They're looked at forms of repression. Okay, Frankel and Noahide theology rather understand the principal normative exercise of freedom as freedom to, not freedom from, which means the freedom to actualize the divine norms, which constitute part of the human essence. The true sense of freedom, in Frankel's words, comes where one submits him or herself freely to a law. Responsibility is thus even more so a binding back together of freedom, a recoupling with a higher order in the sense of law. Binding back together in this sense is no less and no more literal translation of religio, so binding together with the law. That is the idea, to bind with these moral values in an absolute way. That's the freedom to make the choice to keep them no matter what. All right. Now I'm at the bottom of page 31. Freedom in the sense of freedom from still, however, retains a virtue for Noahide theology in the sense of a freedom to register individual particularity in relation to the performance of an abstract moral norm. You see what he's saying there? He's saying that even though there are very specific norms for all people, but the way everyone expresses it and carries them out may be different. Different people are sensitive to different things. People have different talents. People maybe have a certain commandment that they focus on. So that's all part of the freedom from conformity. And there's still a form of specific, unique, personalized self-expression within the Noahide, within the structure of Noahide morality. That does not mean opposition, rather it alludes to the uniqueness of the specific circumstances and the specific qualities of a person in the fulfillment of the divine norm. Like I was saying, doesn't mean self-expression doesn't mean rebelling from the divine laws, but what it means is everyone expressing themselves and on their particular qualities and talents within fulfilling the divine Noahide code. Without violation of the divine norm, it is possible for the individual to perform it in a way which expresses his or her own unique personality and sensibility. Indeed, the greatness of a person or a collective person, a culture, or society consists in its creative and transformative integration of its personality, qualities, and opportunities in the service of God through fulfillment of the Noahide laws. So basically, in other words, he's saying there are certain societies that maybe have a tendency to be more generous in charity. Maybe another society is more has greater hospitality. Maybe another society is more courageous and maybe can come and they're more they can fight the wars of God, so to speak, against evildoers. Maybe another society is more creative in terms of its dealing with nature. So there's so many different ways to express. Of course, there's the 7, and the person shouldn't violate them. And in a certain way, this also may explain an aspect about the 7 laws, why they're negatives. Why are they not positives? Why does it just say you shouldn't do so and so, you shouldn't do so and so? That leaves open a lot of room for creativity within positive aspects that reflect the Noahide values, but not necessarily rigidly within the law. There's a lot more that could possibly be done. And there's so many different levels also, obviously. Again, when we say that the first commandment to nations is not to worship idolatry, that reflects serving God, and there's so many ways to and so many levels how to do that. By the way, also something I heard from the Rabbi during the video of his talk last night was that he said also another innovative thing, in that our sages say, I believe in another midrash, that in terms of human being, he says, "Lo nivrasi ela l'shamish es koini," which means I was created solely or for the purpose of serving my Creator. And so he basically, what he says, that all creatures in the end of the day, all creations were for that purpose. As the verse says, I created everything for my honor and glory, and obviously a human being for certainly as well. So that's another aspect, that every human being was created to sanctify God in the world. And as we said before, to make this world a dwelling place for him. So, but there's a lot of room for specialization. Look, it's kind of like some people, teachers, others are nurses, others are governmental leaders. All these things could be done according to the morals of the 7 laws, and they can be ways to help others. And it's all a question of doing it right, and what a person's talents and sensitivities are, and where they are feel drawn to. Also, I think we also spoke about even like, for example, about Noah. Rabbi Chlorphine writes that Noah's invented certain tools that helped with plowing. Maybe it was the hoe, and through that he brought a lot of relief to society. So even something like that, someone who's very creative and very crafty, as they say, very skilled in creating things, if their intention is to improve the world and to lighten the load on people, so also could be a mitzvah. So I mean, whatever our talents are, it could be worked into the seven laws. Could also have a Noahide rabbi, well, not literal rabbi, but a scholar of the 7 laws. It could be another person that focuses on prayer and their relationship with God. I mean, there's so many different things that could be. Okay, so I think this is a good place to start, because we finished chapter 1, I believe. The soul, we're up to chapter 2, intellect. So, all right. Anyone have a comment? Don't be shy. Probably just, I'm guessing people just really understood this, and it's all good. So I hope so. I hope so. It's not an easy read in some places, I know that. And I went through it kind of quick. Please feel free to read it over and, really think it through. It's great stuff. And thank you for joining me.